devil in the blood. There are some people born with darkness already living inside them. Not the kind you can blame on bad parenting or poverty or trauma or any of the convenient explanations that modern psychology offers to make sense of evil. This is something older, something primordial, something that was waiting in the empty space where a soul should be patient and hungry long before the first breath was drawn. My cousin Rosendo Malverde was one of those people. And what happened to him at the end was not punishment or justice or divine intervention or any of the comforting narratives we tell ourselves to believe that the universe operates according to rules we can understand. It was simply the natural conclusion of a life spent screaming into the void, daring something ancient and terrible to scream back. It screamed back, "My name is Fernando Guerrero. I am 73 years old, and I have carried this story inside me for 25 years, like a stone lodged beneath my ribs, pressing against my heart with every breath. Every night before I close my eyes, I see his face. Not the way he looked when he was alive, when he walked through our village like a predator surveying his territory, cruel and confident and utterly convinced of his own invincibility. No. I see the way he looked at the end in that truck on that dark road when he finally understood that everything he had believed about himself was a lie. When he realized that the darkness he had courted his entire life had finally come to claim what it was owed. I am telling you this story because it demands to be told. Because some warnings only work if people hear them. Because the weight of carrying this knowledge alone has become too heavy for my old bones to bear. And because 2 nights ago something knocked on my door in a rhythm I recognized from the stories Rosendo told before he died, and I know now that my time is running out. This is not entertainment. This is not a campfire tale designed to give you pleasant shivers before you return to your safe, normal life. This is a confession, a caution, and perhaps a curse. By the time you finish reading these words, you will carry this story too. It will live inside you the way it has lived inside me, and you will understand why some doors should never be opened, why some names should never be spoken, why some challenges should never be issued into the waiting dark. God help us both. I grew up in a small rancho in Coahuila in northern Mexico, where the Chihuahuan desert stretches endless and brown in every direction, and the nearest real town requires 3 hours of driving on roads that barely deserve the name. This was a place where time moved differently, where the old beliefs never fully died, no matter how many satellite dishes sprouted on rooftops or how many young people left for the cities seeking modern lives. Mothers still hung crosses above doorways to ward off evil spirits. Grandmothers still whispered prayers over newborn babies and traced invisible symbols on their foreheads to protect them from the evil eye. Everyone went to church on Sunday, not out of habit, but out of genuine belief that the rituals mattered, that the words had power, that something was listening. And everyone knew with equal certainty that demons were real too. The desert teaches you things that city people have forgotten. It teaches you that the world is vast and indifferent, that there are places where humans do not belong, that the darkness between the stars is not empty, but full of things that watch and wait and hunger for opportunities to slip through the cracks in reality. The old people in our village had names for these things, names passed down through generations, names that mix the Catholic teachings of the Spanish conquistadors with far older beliefs that had survived conquest and conversion and centuries of colonial oppression. They knew that evil was not an abstract concept or a metaphor for human failing. Evil was a presence, a force. A reality as concrete as the sun that baked the earth and the wind that scoured the rocks smooth. Rosendo was born into this world in the summer of 1971 during a thunderstorm that the old people still talk about when they gather to share memories of dark times. It was not a normal storm. Lightning struck the church bell tower 3 separate times that night, leaving scorch marks that would remain visible for decades. Black fingers reaching up toward heaven as if something below was trying to tear the steeple down. The river that ran past our village, usually nothing more than a dusty trickle during the dry season, flooded its banks for the first time in 40 years, sweeping away fences and drowning livestock, and leaving behind a smell of rot that lingered for weeks. Dogs howled without stopping from sunset to sunrise, their voices joining in a chorus of animal terror that kept the entire village awake. And the chickens refused to come out of their coops for 3 days afterward, huddling together in the darkness, their eyes wide and white-rimmed with fear. And in a small adobe house at the edge of town, my Aunt Esperanza screamed for 6 hours straight before finally pushing her firstborn son into the world. My grandmother delivered him. Doña Maria Elena Guerrero had brought hundreds of babies into the world over her 40 years. As the village midwife had seen every complication and tragedy and miracle that the process of birth could offer. She had delivered breech babies and twins and babies born with the cord wrapped around their necks. She had saved mothers from hemorrhages that should have killed them, had baptized dying infants with her own tears when no priest was available, had closed the eyes of those who did not survive and comforted the families left behind. She had seen things that would have broken weaker women, and nothing surprised her anymore. Nothing frightened her. Until Rosendo. She told me the story when I was older, when Rosendo had already begun his transformation into something that no longer resembled a human being in any way that mattered. She sat me down in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had prepared remedies and potions for half a century, and poured 2 glasses of mezcal with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or from the memory of what she was about to describe, I could not tell. Then she spoke in a voice I had never heard from her before. The voice of someone describing a nightmare they could not wake from no matter how hard they tried. The baby did not cry, she said, staring into her glass, as if she could see the past reflected in the amber liquid. Every baby cries, mija. It is the first thing they do, the most natural thing in the world. It is how they clear their lungs of fluid, how they announce themselves to the world of the living, how they declare that they have arrived and intend to stay. But this one came out silent, completely silent, not a whimper, not a gasp, not a single sound. I thought he was dead. I was preparing myself to tell Esperanza that her son had not survived, that all those months of prayer and hope and desperate longing had come to nothing, that God had taken another child from her womb. She paused, took a long drink that emptied half her glass, and continued in a voice barely above a whisper. Then he opened his eyes. Newborns do not open their eyes, Mia. Not right away. Their eyes are sensitive, sealed against the harsh light of the world they have just entered, still adjusting to existence outside the darkness of the womb. But this one opened his eyes immediately, wide open, both of them at once, and looked directly at me. Not the unfocused gaze of an infant trying to make sense of blurry shapes and shadows. He looked at me the way you would look at someone you recognized, someone you had been expecting, someone you had been waiting for, perhaps, for a very long time. "What did you do?" I asked my own voice, barely audible, my hands wrapped around my untouched glass of mezcal. "I almost dropped him," she admitted, and I could see the shame of that confession in her eyes, the guilt of a midwife who had nearly failed in her most basic duty to protect the vulnerable. "I have held dying men in my arms, Mija. I have watched children buried in the earth before they learned to walk or speak their first words. I have seen things that would turn your hair white and give you nightmares for the rest of your life. But I have never, not once in all my years on this earth, wanted to run away from a baby. Until that moment. There was something in those eyes, something that should not have been there, something that had no business looking out from the face of a newborn child. Something old, something knowing, something patient and hungry and deeply, terribly amused, like looking into a well and seeing something looking back at you from the darkness at the bottom, something that has been waiting down there for a very long time. She finished her mezcal and poured another with hands that shook more visibly now, sloshing liquid onto the wooden table. And then he laughed. She closed her eyes, and I saw tears beginning to form at the corners, tracking down the deep wrinkles of her weathered face. Not a cry that sounded like laughter. Not a gurgle or a coo or any of the sounds that babies make. A real laugh, mija, low and knowing and deeply satisfied, like an old man who has just heard a particularly clever joke at someone else's expense. It came from deep in his chest, from somewhere that should not exist in a body that small, from depths that a newborn simply does not possess. I have heard many sounds in my life, but I had never heard anything like that, and I hope to God and all his saints that I never hear anything like it again. I asked her what she did then. I handed him to his mother, she said, opening her eyes to look at me with an expression of haunted resignation that I would never forget. And I went outside and vomited in the garden until there was nothing left in my stomach. And then I prayed. I prayed harder than I have ever prayed in my life before or since. I begged the Virgin Mary to protect that child, to drive out whatever had taken root inside him, to fill the empty spaces in his soul with grace and light and love. She fell silent for the long moment, staring at something I could not see. But I do not think anyone was listening, she finally said. Or maybe something was listening. But it was not God. It was not the Virgin. It was not any of the saints whose names I called out in my desperation. It was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting for that child. Something that recognized him as its own. Rosendo's parents were simple people, good people, the kind of salt-of-the-earth folk who formed the backbone of communities like ours. Esteban Malverde worked the land and raised cattle just as his father had done before him, just as his father's father had done, in an unbroken chain of toil and tradition stretching back generations beyond memory. He was a quiet man with rough hands calloused by decades of labor and honest eyes that met yours directly when he spoke. He believed that hard work could solve any problem, that faith could move any mountain, that love could redeem any soul, no matter how lost or damaged. Esperanza was the most devout woman in our family, perhaps in our entire village. She prayed the rosary every morning before dawn and every night before sleep, her fingers moving over the worn wooden beads with the practiced ease of decades of repetition. She never missed Sunday Mass, not even when she was sick with fever, not even when the roads were flooded by summer storms, not even when doing so required walking for hours under the brutal desert sun. She kept pictures of the Virgin of Guadalupe in every room of their small house, each one a miniature shrine adorned with candles and fresh flowers that she tended with the same devotion other women gave to their gardens. And she wore a silver crucifix around her neck, a crucifix that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that, a family heirloom that she never removed for any reason, not even to sleep, not even to bathe, not even in the darkest moments of her life when faith seemed like a cruel joke. They had prayed for a son. They had prayed for years through the anguish of 2 miscarriages and 1 stillbirth that had nearly killed Esperanza, along with the baby that had left her bleeding and delirious for 3 days while my grandmother fought to keep her alive. They had prayed through tears and doubt and the quiet creeping despair that comes when God seems to have forgotten you exist, when every petition goes unanswered, when hope becomes harder and harder to maintain. When Esperanza finally became pregnant again after years of disappointment and loss, she spent 9 months on her knees before the altar begging the Virgin to let this child survive, offering promises and bargains and everything she had to give. The child survived. But I do not think it was the Virgin who answered her prayers. The first years of Rosendo's life were strange but not yet alarming. He was a quiet baby, almost unnaturally so, rarely crying even when hungry or wet or uncomfortable. He seemed content to lie in his crib for hours, watching the world with those dark eyes that seemed far too aware for his age, tracking movements across the room with an intensity that made visitors uncomfortable. He studied faces with the focused attention of a scientist, examining specimens, cataloging and analyzing and filing away information for future use. But babies are strange creatures, and parents are endlessly creative in explaining away anything that does not fit their expectations, anything that threatens the comforting narrative they have constructed about their child and their future. He was just observant, Esperanza would say, when relatives commented on the unsettling quality of her son's gaze, on the way he watched them without blinking. He was just curious. He was just different, special, gifted perhaps. She was right about one thing. He was different. By the time Rosendo was 3, the differences had become impossible to ignore or explain away with comfortable platitudes. He did not play like other children. While his cousins chased each other through the dusty streets, laughing and shouting and tumbling in the dirt while they kicked balls made of rags and built forts from scraps of wood and created imaginary worlds populated by heroes and monsters, Rosendo sat alone in corners, watching, always watching. His eyes would follow people around the room, tracking their movements with an attention that felt less like childish curiosity and more like assessment, like calculation, like a predator learning the habits of prey. When adults asked what he was doing, trying to engage him in normal conversation, he would smile his strange little smile and say he was counting. Counting what they would ask, bending down to his level, using the bright, encouraging voices that adults use with small children. Counting until it is time, he would answer in a voice that carried no childish inflection, no innocent uncertainty, no trace of the playful imagination that should characterize a 3-year-old's speech. No one knew what that meant. No one wanted to know. He spoke early and spoke well, far earlier and far better than any child had a right to. He used words that children his age should not know, constructing sentences with a precision and complexity that unnerved even the adults who heard them. He asked questions that had no good answers, questions that seemed designed to probe the boundaries of faith and certainty, to find the cracks in the comfortable stories people told themselves about the nature of reality. Why do people die? Where do they go when they stop breathing? What happens to the part of them that thinks and feels and remembers? Is it gone forever, or does it go somewhere else? Is there something waiting for them in the dark? Esperanza tried to give him religious answers, the same answers her mother had given her, the same answers that had sustained generations of believers through hardship and loss and the inexplicable cruelties of existence. She told him about heaven, about the eternal peace that awaited the faithful, about angels with white wings and streets paved with gold and the loving embrace of God the Father. She told him about God's infinite love, about the promise of reunion with those we have lost, about the triumph of light over darkness and good over evil. Rosendo listened politely, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he tilted his head to one side, considering her words the way you might consider a fairy tale told by a well-meaning but naive adult. "That is not what happens," he said, his voice flat and certain, brooking no argument. "I know what really happens. The dark told me." "What dark?" Esperanza asked, her voice trembling with a fear she could not name, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the afternoon. Rosendo just smiled and went back to his counting. "The cruelty began when he was 5. I was 8 years old at the time, old enough to remember everything with painful clarity, young enough to be marked by it forever. I had a kitten named Naranja, a tiny orange thing with white paws and bright green eyes that my father had given me for my birthday. I loved that kitten more than I had ever loved anything in my short life. I carried her everywhere, tucked against my chest, feeling the vibration of her purr against my heart like a second heartbeat. I slept with her curled beside my pillow, her small, warm body a comfort against the fears that came in the night. I talked to her about my hopes and dreams and worries as if she could understand every word, as if she were the one true friend who would never judge me or betray my secrets. Rosendo noticed. He always noticed the things people loved. Even at that young age, he had a talent for identifying weakness, for finding the soft spots that could be pressed to cause maximum pain. He was drawn to vulnerability the way certain insects are drawn to wounds, not out of curiosity but out of hunger, not to help but to exploit. He found me playing with naranja behind my grandmother's house one afternoon in the shade of an old mesquite tree whose gnarled branches had been my refuge since I first learned to climb. I was brushing her fur with my fingers, watching her chase shadows, lost in the simple, uncomplicated happiness of childhood. I did not hear him approach. One moment, I was alone with my kitten, and the next moment he was there standing a few feet away, watching us with his head tilted slightly to one side, his expression curious and cold and utterly without warmth. "Let me hold it," he said. "Not a request. A command." "No," I replied, immediately pulling Naranja closer to my chest, feeling her small claws dig into my shirt. The word came out before I could think, pure instinct warning bells ringing in some primitive part of my brain that recognized danger even when my conscious mind could not articulate why. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He did not try to take the kitten by force. He just smiled, that empty smile, the one that never reached his eyes, the one that made you feel like you were looking at a mask rather than a face. Then he turned and walked away without another word. 3 days later, Naranja disappeared. I searched everywhere. I called her name until my throat was raw and my voice was barely a whisper. I walked through the village and the surrounding fields, looking under every bush and behind every building, asking everyone I met if they had seen a small orange cat. I cried myself to sleep every night for a week, convinced that she had run away, that she was lost and scared and hungry somewhere out in the desert, wondering why I had abandoned her. Then I found her in the barn. I will not describe what he had done to her. Some images should not be put into words, should not be given the power of language to spread from mind to mind like a virus, to take root in imaginations and grow into nightmares that never fully fade. There are things that once seen can never be unseen, and there are things that once described become part of the listener forever, whether they want them or not. What I saw in that barn was one of those things. But I will tell you this, what I found was not the work of a curious child exploring the boundaries of life and death. It was deliberate. It was methodical. It was almost artistic in its cruelty, arranged with a care that suggested not impulse, but planning, not accident, but intention, not curiosity, but pleasure. A 5-year-old should not have known how to do what had been done. A 5-year-old should not have wanted to. And on the wall behind her small broken body, written in something dark and dried that I knew was not paint, were words that a 5-year-old should not have known how to spell. "The dark says hello." I screamed until the adults came running. They found Rosendo sitting outside the barn just a few feet from the door, humming to himself and picking at his fingernails as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the horror inside was nothing more than a boring afternoon's entertainment already forgotten. When they demanded to know who was responsible, he looked up at them with those empty eyes and said the cat had done it to herself. She wanted to see what we cannot see. No one believed him, but no one did anything either. He was only 5. He was family. He was blood. These things did not happen in families like ours could not happen, so they must not have happened. Must have been an accident, a misunderstanding, a terrible coincidence that would never be repeated. But it was repeated, again and again and again. Animals died around Rosendo with disturbing regularity over the years that followed. Dogs that barked at him too aggressively were found poisoned within days. Foam dried around their muzzles, their bodies twisted in the final agony of their deaths. Chickens that pecked too close to his feet had their necks wrung, and their bodies arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, placed in circles or lines that suggested meaning, even if no one could decipher what that meaning might be. A neighbor's goat that wandered into the Malverde yard was discovered with its eyes removed, placed neatly on a flat rock beside its body, as if on display, as if meant to be found and understood as a message, though a message saying what no one dared to guess. No one could ever prove Rosendo was responsible. He was never caught in the act, never seen with blood on his hands, never found standing over a fresh corpse. He always had an alibi, always had an explanation delivered in that calm, flat voice of his, always had that same empty smile that said he knew exactly what everyone suspected and simply did not care. But the deaths followed him like a shadow follows its owner, and eventually the other families in the rancho started keeping their animals locked up tight whenever he was nearby, started crossing the street when they saw him coming, started making the sign of the cross behind his back when they thought no one was watching. If only they had known that the animals were just practice, the dress rehearsal for the main performance. The humans would come next. Rosendo's parents, desperate beyond measure to find something that might fix their son, began taking him to church with increased fervor. Not just on Sundays anymore, but several times a week, sometimes every single day, hoping that constant exposure to God's house might somehow drive out whatever was wrong with him, might fill those empty spaces inside him with grace and light and love. They consulted with Father Fernando, the elderly priest who had baptized 3 generations of our family, who had married Esteban and Esperanza in that same small church 20 years earlier, who had prayed over the tiny graves of their lost babies and offered what comfort words could provide. Father Fernando was a good man, a kind man, a man who had devoted his entire life to the service of God and the care of souls entrusted to him. He had seen much in his 7 decades of life, had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior from the most selfless acts of sacrificial love to the most brutal expressions of sadistic cruelty. He believed with the unwavering faith of a true servant of God that no soul was beyond redemption, that the light of Christ could penetrate even the deepest darkness, that prayer and patience and unconditional love could transform even the most troubled heart. He agreed to work with the boy personally, to meet with him several times a week for religious instruction and spiritual guidance. He approached the task with the same dedication he brought to everything, preparing special lessons, selecting passages of Scripture that spoke of redemption and forgiveness and the infinite mercy of God, praying for hours before each session, for the wisdom and strength to reach this troubled child, to find the crack in his armor through which light might enter. The first session ended in disaster. I was not there when it happened, but Father Fernando told my grandmother everything afterwards, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his rosary, his voice cracking with an emotion that might have been fear or might have been something deeper, something that shook the very foundations of the faith he had built his entire life upon. He said that the session had begun normally enough, or as normally as anything involving Rosendo could begin. The boy sat quietly in the pew, his hands folded in his lap, appearing to listen as Father Fernando spoke about God's love for all his children, about the importance of kindness and compassion, about the peace that comes from living a righteous life. The boy's face was blank, unreadable, a mask that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. But Father Fernando had worked with difficult children before, children from broken homes and violent backgrounds, and he knew that patience was essential, that trust had to be earned one small step at a time. Then he decided to bless the child. It was a simple blessing, the kind he had performed thousands of times over his long career, a ritual so familiar he could do it in his sleep. He dipped his fingers in holy water from the font near the altar water that had been blessed according to the ancient rituals of the church water that was meant to purify and protect, to wash away sin and ward off evil. When he sprinkled that water on Rosendo's forehead, the boy screamed, not a cry of surprise or discomfort, not the startled yelp of a child who had been splashed unexpectedly and did not like it. A scream of pure rage, deep and resonant and utterly inhuman, as if it came from somewhere far larger than a child's small body, as if it erupted from depths that should not exist within any living creature, as if something vast and ancient and furious was speaking through that young throat. That burns, Rosendo shrieked, clawing at his face with his small fingers, leaving red marks on his skin, his body convulsing as if in genuine agony. "How dare you burn me in his house? How dare you?" Father Fernando, shaken to his core but determined to fulfill his duty, tried to continue the blessing, tried to recite the prayers he had spoken so many times. They were as natural as breathing, as automatic as his own heartbeat. But Rosendo cut him off with words that would haunt the old priest until the day he died, and perhaps beyond. "You are saying it wrong, Father," the boy said, his voice suddenly calm and cold, the screaming rage replaced by something far more disturbing, a terrible, knowing amusement. The next line is, "Exorcizamus te omnis immundus, spiritus omnis satanica potestas omnis incursio infernalis adversarii." Shall I teach you, old man? Shall I show you how it is supposed to be done? Then he began to recite the Roman ritual of exorcism in flawless Latin. Father Fernando had studied that ritual in seminary more than 50 years earlier, during a time when such things were taken more seriously by the church, when priests were still trained to recognize and combat genuine demonic influence rather than referring troubled parishioners to psychiatrists. He had performed the ritual twice in his long career, both times on adults who exhibited signs of possession, both of whom were later determined to have been suffering from severe mental illness rather than supernatural affliction. But he knew the words, he knew the cadences, he knew the precise pronunciation, that the ritual required the ancient formulas that had been passed down through centuries of church tradition. Rosendo recited it perfectly. Not just the words, but the intonation. Not just the phrases, but the pauses. Not just the pronunciation, but the meaning behind each syllable, the weight of each invocation. A 6-year-old boy from a rancho in northern Mexico who had never studied Latin, who could barely read Spanish, who had never seen a copy of the Roman ritual or attended a seminary or received any formal religious education beyond simple Sunday school lessons about Noah's Ark, and the Good Samaritan spoke the ancient words as if he had written them himself, as if he had heard them many times before from the other side, as if they were as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Father Fernando collapsed. The shock was too much for his aged heart, and he crumpled to the floor of the sanctuary like a puppet whose strings had been cut, like a building whose foundation had suddenly crumbled. 2 altar boys had to carry him to the rectory, where he lay in bed for 3 days, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling and whisper prayers that seemed to bring him no comfort, that seemed to echo back empty and unanswered. When he finally recovered enough to speak coherently, he summoned Esperanza and Esteban to the rectory. They came immediately, desperate for any guidance, any hope, any explanation for what their son had become. Father Fernando looked at them with eyes that had aged a decade in those 3 days, eyes that had seen something that had shaken the very foundations of the faith he had spent his entire life building and serving. "Your son is not possessed," he told them, his voice barely above a whisper, his hands trembling on the arms of his chair. "I have seen possession, or what I thought was possession. I have studied it. I know the signs, the symptoms, the progression. This is different. This is something else entirely. Possession is when something enters from outside, when an external entity takes control of a soul that belongs to God. When a demon invades a temple it has no right to occupy. But your son?" He trailed off, struggling to find words for something that defied the categories his training had provided, something that existed outside the neat theological frameworks he had relied upon for 50 years. Whatever is inside your son was not put there by any external force. It was born there. It is part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being, inseparable from his identity. There is nothing to cast out because there was never anything else to begin with. There is no innocent soul being held captive, crying out for liberation. There is only what he is. "What can we do?" Esperanza begged, tears streaming down her face, her rosary clutched so tightly in her hands that the beads left deep red marks on her palms. There must be something, some prayer, some ritual, some saint we can petition, some relic we can obtain. Please, Father. He is my son. He is my child. I carried him in my body. I felt him move inside me. There must be something. Father Fernando looked at her with an expression of profound sorrow, the sorrow of a man who had dedicated his life to offering hope and now found himself with none to give, who had spent 50 years promising people that God's love was infinite and now confronted something that seemed to exist entirely outside that love's reach. Pray, he said finally. Pray for yourselves. Pray for your daughter. Pray for the strength to endure whatever is coming, but do not pray for Rosendo. I do not think those prayers will reach where they need to go. I do not think anything can reach him now. He has already made his choice, or perhaps the choice was made for him before he was born. Either way, the door is open, and I do not know how to close it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with a finality that brooked no argument, that offered no false hope. Do not bring him back to this church. Do not bring him into God's house again. Whatever he is, he does not belong here, and I fear greatly what might happen if he returns. He refused to elaborate further. He refused to see Rosendo again, not even from a distance. Within a year, Father Fernando requested a transfer to a parish in Mexico City, citing health reasons that no one quite believed. He never returned to our village. Years later, word reached us that he had died in a monastery, having taken a vow of silence in his final years, spending his days in prayer and contemplation, seeking answers to questions that had tormented him since that day in the church when a 6-year-old boy had recited the exorcism ritual back to him in perfect Latin. Some said he died peacefully, surrounded by his brothers in faith, finally finding the peace that had eluded him for so long. Others whispered that he died screaming, that his final words were in Latin, that he was reciting the same exorcism that Rosendo had thrown back at him all those years ago, as if still trying to complete the ritual he had been unable to finish. I do not know which version is true. Perhaps both are, perhaps neither. Perhaps it does not matter anymore. The incident that made me truly understand what my cousin was, that stripped away any remaining illusion that he might somehow be reached or saved or redeemed, happened the following year on Dia de los Muertos. The Day of the Dead is the most important holiday in Mexican culture, more significant even than Christmas or Easter. A time when the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin as tissue paper when families gather to remember and honor those who have passed on to the other side. It is not a morbid occasion, but a celebration, a recognition that death is not an ending, but a transition, that our loved ones remain connected to us even after they have left their physical bodies behind, that love transcends the grave and memory keeps the dead alive in a way that matters. Our entire family had gathered at the cemetery that November 2nd, as we did every year, as our ancestors had done for generations beyond counting. We cleaned the graves of our departed relatives, pulling weeds and scrubbing headstones until they gleamed in the autumn sunlight. We laid out marigolds, the flowers of the dead, their bright orange petals creating paths of color that the spirits could follow back to the world of the living. We placed candles and photographs and offerings of food and drink, all the things our loved ones had enjoyed in life, inviting them to join us one more time, to sit with us and share a meal and know that they were not forgotten. Children ran between the headstones, laughing and playing their joy, a counterpoint to the solemnity of the occasion, a reminder that life goes on even in the presence of death. Adults shared memories and shed quiet tears, grief and gratitude mingling in equal measure. The air smelled of incense and flowers and the special bread that is baked only for this day, sweet and shaped like bones and skulls, a reminder that death comes for everyone, but need not be feared. Rosendo stood apart from all of it. He had positioned himself at the far edge of the cemetery near an unmarked grave that most people avoided, that parents warned their children away from. According to local legend, it was the final resting place of a man named Aurelio Sanchez, who had lived in our village more than a century ago. Aurelio had been poor, desperately poor, struggling to feed his family in a land that offered little mercy to those without resources or connections. Then suddenly, inexplicably, his fortunes had changed. He became wealthy almost overnight, buying land and cattle and a fine house with money that seemed to come from nowhere, living like a king in a kingdom of peasants who whispered about him behind his back. People said that he had made a deal with the devil, that he had traded his immortal soul for earthly riches and earthly pleasures. They said that the devil had eventually come to collect what was owed, that Aurelio had been found dead in his fine house with an expression of such terror on his face that the undertaker had refused to prepare the body, that he had been buried quickly and quietly in an unmarked grave, because no priest would say words over someone who had sold himself to Satan. Whether the legend was true, I cannot say. I have learned over the years that legends often contain more truth than the official histories that replace them. But Rosendo was drawn to that grave like iron, to a magnet standing over the weathered earth with an expression on his face that I had never seen before and would never forget. It was an expression of admiration, of recognition, of hunger. I walked over to see what had captured his attention, so completely moved by a curiosity that I would later recognize as foolish, as dangerous as the kind of impulse that leads people into dark places from which they never fully return. "He was stupid," Rosendo said, without looking at me, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if he were commenting on the weather or the quality of the soil. "Who was stupid?" I asked, stopping a few feet away, close enough to hear but far enough to run if I needed to. "This man, Aurelio." He tilted his head, considering the grave with the detached interest of a scholar examining an artifact from a dead civilization. "He sold his soul because he was afraid of losing it. He made a bargain because he did not believe he deserved what he wanted, because he thought he needed permission to take it because he was weak." His voice carried a contempt that was startling in its intensity, a scorn that seemed far too mature for a 7-year-old child. "But I am not afraid. I do not need to make deals or sign contracts in blood. I do not need to sell anything." "Why not?" I asked, the words escaping before I could stop them, before the wiser part of my mind could remind me that engaging with Rosendo was never a good idea, that every conversation with him felt like walking along the edge of a cliff. He turned to face me, and in the fading light of that autumn afternoon, with the candles flickering on the graves around us, and the smell of marigolds heavy in the air, and the sound of prayers rising from the mourners nearby, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Because I already belonged to him, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout, that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper and more primitive inside me. "I am the son of El Diablo. His blood runs in my veins, has run in them since before I was born, will run in them until the end of time and beyond. And one day, when I finally meet my father face to face, I will show him that I am more terrifying than he has ever been. I will make him proud, or I will make him afraid. Either way, he will know my name. He will speak it with respect." The candles on the graves around us flickered and died all at once, as if snuffed by an invisible hand that moved faster than sight could follow. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still, heavy and thick and hard to breathe. But every flame within 20 feet of where we stood went out simultaneously, plunging that corner of the cemetery into premature darkness, while the rest of the graveyard remained lit by hundreds of dancing flames. And from somewhere in the shadows between the headstones I heard a sound that might have been laughter. It was not human laughter. It was something older, something deeper, something that had been laughing since before humans existed to hear it, since before the earth itself had cooled from its fiery birth. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the ground beneath my feet, and the sky above my head, and the empty spaces between the graves where nothing should be able to hide. I ran all the way home without stopping, my lungs burning and my heart pounding and my mind filled with a terror that I could not name. I hid under my bed and did not come out until morning, and when my mother asked what was wrong, I could not find words to explain. How do you tell someone that you have just witnessed a door opening that should have stayed forever closed? How do you describe the sound of something ancient and evil acknowledging its own? That night was the first time Rosendo publicly declared himself the son of the devil. It would not be the last. Over the years that followed, he would make that claim hundreds of times, thousands of times, in dozens of places to anyone who would listen and many who would not. He screamed it in cantinas when he was drunk on cheap tequila. He whispered it over the bodies of his victims when he was stone-cold sober. He carved it into flesh and wrote it in blood and proclaimed it to the heavens and the earth and everything in between. And every single time he said those words, something heard him. Something remembered. Something waited. A few weeks after that Day of the Dead, a stranger came to our rancho. She arrived at midnight, which should have been the first warning, should have been enough to keep everyone's doors locked and lights out. No one travels through the desert at midnight. The roads are too dangerous, full of animals and potholes, and worse things that the old people do not like to name. Bandits prey on travelers, foolish enough to venture out after dark. The desert itself is treacherous, easy to get lost in, easy to die in if you do not know what you're doing. But there she was, knocking on the door of the Malverde house, while the rest of the village slept, her presence announced by nothing but the soft sound of her knuckles against wood. She was a santera from Veracruz, an old woman with blind white eyes that seemed to see everything and skin like cracked leather that had been baked by decades of tropical sun. She practiced the old ways, the traditions that mixed African beliefs brought by slaves with indigenous wisdom, preserved through centuries of colonial oppression and Catholic imagery imposed by Spanish conquerors. She was a priestess of a faith that had no official name, a keeper of secrets that predated the arrival of Europeans in the New World, a guardian of knowledge that most people preferred to pretend did not exist. She did not wait to be invited inside. She pushed past Esperanza, who had answered the door in her nightgown, too surprised to protest, and walked straight through the house to the room where Rosendo slept. She stood over his bed for a long moment, her blind eyes fixed on his sleeping form, her lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been something else, entirely something older and stranger than any prayer the church had ever sanctioned. Then she turned to face his terrified parents who had followed her in confused silence, not knowing what else to do. "I have come to warn you," she said, her voice like dry leaves rustling in an autumn wind, like bones clicking together in an old grave. "The child you are raising in this house is not a lost soul. He is not sick. He is not damaged. He is not possessed by anything external. He is a door." A door to what Esteban asked, his voice barely audible, his hand instinctively reaching for the crucifix that hung above his son's bed, as if that simple piece of wood and metal could offer any protection against what the old woman was describing. The santera moved to the window and stared out at the night, her blind eyes reflecting the pale light of the stars, seeing things that those with functioning vision could never perceive. "There are souls that are born with holes in them," she said, her tone taking on the cadence of someone reciting a lesson learned long ago, passed down through generations of practitioners. Empty spaces where something should be but is not. These holes are not accidents. They are not mistakes made by a careless creator. They are invitations, doorways for things that exist outside our world to enter bridges between what is and what should never be. Most of these doors stay closed because most people are too afraid to open them, because they sense instinctively that some threshold should never be crossed, that some welcomes should never be extended. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with something that might have been grief, or might have been resignation, or might have been both at once. "But your son has been trying to open his door since the moment he was born. He has been calling out to what waits on the other side, inviting it in, welcoming it. And he is succeeding. With every cruel act, with every proclamation, with every time he speaks the names of the darkness, the door opens wider. Soon it will be wide enough for something to pass through. Something that should never walk in our world. What can we do? Esperanza whispered, her rosary clutched against her chest, her eyes bright with tears that would not fall. Nothing. The word fell like a stone dropped into a deep well, disappearing into depths that had no bottom. The door is too wide now. It has been too wide for years. The only question that remains is who will walk through it first. Your son into their world or something from their world into ours. Either way, once that crossing happens, nothing will ever be the same. She turned and walked toward the exit, her bare feet silent on the tile floor, moving with a certainty that her blindness should have made impossible. At the threshold she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "There is one more thing you should know," she said. "I came here because I had a vision. I saw what your son will become, what he will do, the suffering he will cause, the lives he will destroy, the darkness he will spread wherever he goes. And I saw how it will end for him, how the bill will finally come due." She paused, and her blind eyes seemed to focus on something far away, something terrible, something that made even this woman who dealt in darkness and spirits flinch as if struck. "It will not be quick," she said, "and it will not be painless, and it will last forever." Then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness outside as completely as if she had never existed, as if she had been nothing more than a dream that faded upon waking. They found her the next morning dead in a small shack at the edge of the village where she had apparently been staying. Her blind white eyes had been removed from their sockets and placed on the pillow beside her head, positioned as if they were staring at whoever found the body, as if even in death she was still watching, still seeing. Her face was frozen in an expression that no one could quite identify, that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which you looked at it. She was smiling, or screaming, or both at once, as if she had seen something in her final moments that was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrible thing imaginable. The doctor said her heart had stopped, though he could not explain why, could not point to any physical cause. He could not explain the expression on her face, or the position of the eyes, or the single word that someone had carved into the wooden wall above her bed in letters that still smoked faintly as if burned by an invisible hand that left no other mark. Soon. No one investigated further. In places like our rancho, some doors are better left unopened, some questions are better left unasked. Some answers are more dangerous than the ignorance they replace, but my grandmother knew. She had known the Santera, had corresponded with her over the years, had sought her counsel on matters that the church could not or would not address. She pulled me aside after the burial, her grip on my arm tight enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks, her eyes fierce with an intensity that frightened me almost as much as what I had seen in the cemetery. "Stay away from him," she hissed, her voice low and urgent and brooking no argument. "Whatever is coming for Rosendo, you do not want to be nearby when it arrives. Promise me, Mija, promise me you will keep your distance. Promise me you will stay away from that boy." I promised. And for the rest of my childhood, I kept that promise as best I could, avoiding Rosendo whenever possible, leaving rooms when he entered them, crossing streets when I saw him coming. But I still watched. I watched as Rosendo grew from a disturbing child into a terrifying teenager. I watched as his cruelty escalated from animals to humans, as the scope of his darkness expanded to encompass more and more victims. I watched as he left a trail of broken things in his wake, shattered lives and shattered minds and shattered bodies that no one had the power or the courage to stop him from creating, and I waited like everyone else in our village to see what would happen when the door finally opened all the way. The years that followed were a slow descent into a darkness that seemed to have no bottom, no limit, no end point where things could not possibly get any worse. By 12, Rosendo had graduated from tormenting animals to terrorizing humans, as if the suffering of lesser creatures no longer provided sufficient nourishment for whatever hunger lived inside him. The incident with Maestro Rodrigo was the first to draw human blood, though it would be far from the last. Merely the opening act in a long performance of cruelty that would span decades and claim more victims than anyone would ever be able to count. Maestro Rodrigo was a patient man in his late 50s, who had taught school in our village for 3 decades, who had educated 2 generations of children and watched them grow from awkward students into productive adults with families of their own. He had taken pride in every success and mourned every failure, had stayed late to help struggling students, and had spent his own meager salary on supplies when the government funding fell short. He believed with the optimism of a born teacher that every child could be reached, that somewhere inside even the most troubled student was a spark of goodness waiting to be nurtured into flame, that patience and kindness could accomplish what punishment and fear could not. Rosendo proved him catastrophically wrong. It happened over something trivial, as these things often do, as if the universe takes special pleasure in demonstrating that the worst consequences can flow from the smallest causes. A math problem on a chalkboard. A request to show his work. A gentle hand placed on a shoulder in encouragement, the kind of touch that teachers give to students every day without thinking, without any intent beyond simple human connection. "You should not have touched me." Rosendo said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, his eyes fixed on the teacher with an intensity that made the older man take an involuntary step backward that triggered some ancient prey animal instinct to flee from a predator. "Now something bad will happen to you." The words hung in the air of that small classroom, and every child present felt a chill run down their spine, felt the temperature drop by several degrees, felt the wrongness that radiated from Rosendo like heat from a fire. That night, Maestro Rodrigo's house caught fire. He survived, but barely pulled from the flames by neighbors who saw the glow against the night sky and came running with buckets of water that did almost nothing against the inferno. The burns covered 40% of his body, leaving scars that would mark him for the rest of his life, that would make children stare and adults look away, that would serve as a permanent reminder of the night everything changed. The fire marshal ruled it an accident, a candle left too close to curtains, a tragedy, but not a crime, nothing that warranted further investigation. Everyone in the rancho knew better, but knowing and proving are different things, separated by a gulf that justice cannot always bridge, and Rosendo had already learned how to keep his hands clean while his victims burned, how to maintain plausible deniability while delivering unmistakable messages. Maestro Rodrigo left within the month, unable to bear the sight of the boy who had destroyed his life, walking freely through the streets, unable to teach in a classroom where that boy might appear at any moment. He moved to Monterey to live with his daughter and never returned to teaching, never stood before a classroom again. I heard years later that he had died in a psychiatric facility, convinced until the end that something with Rosendo's face visited him every night, standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with those empty eyes, smiling that terrible smile, waiting for him to fall asleep so the nightmares could begin again. The incident with Marisol happened a few months after the fire, and it was the moment when even his own parents could no longer deny what their son had become, could no longer take refuge in explanations and excuses, and the desperate hope that things would somehow get better. Marisol was Rosendo's younger sister, 9 years old, sweet-natured and devout, in a way that seemed almost miraculous given the household she had grown up in. She was everything her brother was not: kind where he was cruel, gentle where he was violent, quick to laugh where he was quick to anger, slow to judge where he was swift to condemn. She had a gift for finding beauty in ordinary things, for making people smile even on their darkest days, for bringing light into rooms that had known nothing but shadow. Esperanza often said that God had given her Marisol to balance out Rosendo, an angel, to counterweight the demon proof that her womb could produce something good as well as something terrible. Rosendo hated her for it. He hated the way their parents looked at her with uncomplicated love, with joy unmarred by fear, with the simple happiness that parents are supposed to feel when they look at their children. He hated the way she prayed for his soul every night, kneeling beside her bed with her hands clasped and her eyes closed, asking God to heal whatever was broken inside her brother, as if he were something damaged that needed fixing rather than something whole that had simply been made different. Most of all, he hated that she was not afraid of him. She alone among all the people in our village still smiled at him, still tried to include him in games, still believed that somewhere inside her brother was a person worth loving, a soul worth saving. The night it happened, their parents had gone to a wedding in a neighboring village, a celebration they could not politely refuse to attend. They left the children alone, something they had done before without incident, something that millions of parents do every day without anything going wrong. Rosendo was 12, old enough to be responsible for a few hours, old enough to be trusted with his younger sister's safety. Marisol was reading her Bible in the living room, her lips moving slightly as she sounded out the more difficult words when Rosendo appeared in the doorway. He was holding a kitchen knife, the big one their mother used to butcher chickens, the one with the blade that caught the lamplight and threw it back in sharp silver flashes. He was smiling. "Tonight, I am going to prove something to you," he said, his voice calm and conversational, as if he were discussing the weather or asking her to pass the salt. "I am going to prove that your God does not exist, that no one is watching over you, that when you scream for help, when you beg for salvation, nothing will come. No angels, no saints, no miracles. Just you and me and this knife." Marisol ran. She ran through every room of that small house, her bare feet slapping against the tile floor, her nightgown tangling around her legs. Her brother followed with the knife, never hurrying, never losing his smile, never showing any emotion beyond a calm, satisfied interest in her terror. He was enjoying the chase, savoring her fear, drawing it out because the anticipation was almost as sweet as the act itself would be, because her desperation was a flavor he wanted to taste fully before the main course. She escaped through a back window, cutting her hands on the rough wooden frame, and hid in the hay barn, burying herself under a pile of dried grass, pressing her hand over her mouth so hard that she tasted blood, trying to muffle the sobs that kept trying to escape. Outside, she could hear Rosendo's footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the barn like a predator circling trapped prey, in no hurry because there was nowhere for her to go. "I know you are in there, little sister," he called out, his voice sing-song and playful, the voice of a child playing a game rather than hunting a victim. "Your God is not coming. He has never come for anyone. All those prayers, all those candles, all those hours on your knees, and what has he ever done for you? Nothing. He does nothing because he is nothing. But something else might come. Something that actually answers when I call. Something that has been listening to me my whole life. He stood outside that barn for 3 hours. 3 hours of footsteps and humming, and the occasional tap of the knife blade against the wooden walls. A rhythm like a heartbeat, like a countdown. 3 hours of whispered promises about what he would do when he finally found her description so detailed and terrible that Marisol's hair turned partially white from shock, that her mind nearly broke from the weight of imagining what he described. 3 hours of hell for a 9-year-old girl who did not understand why the brother she loved wanted to hurt her, who still believed even then that love could conquer anything, that faith could move mountains, that God would not abandon one of his children. Finally, when the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, when the roosters started their morning chorus and the world began to wake from sleep, he spoke again. "I am going to let you live tonight," he said, and she could hear the disappointment in his voice, the frustration of a hunger left unfed. "But remember this, Marisol. One day when you least expect it, when you have almost forgotten this night, when you feel safe again, I will finish what I started. And no one will save you, not your God, not our parents, not anyone. You belong to me now. You will always belong to me." Then he walked away, whistling a cheerful tune as if nothing had happened, as if the past 3 hours had been nothing more than a pleasant way to pass the time. When their parents returned, they found Marisol still in the barn, catatonic with shock, her eyes staring at nothing, her mouth open in a scream that had no sound. She did not speak for days. When she finally told them what happened, her voice a monotone whisper that seemed to come from somewhere far away, Esteban beat Rosendo with a leather strap until his arm was too tired to lift, until his hand was blistered and his shoulder ached and his breath came in ragged gasps. Rosendo took every blow without flinching, without crying, without making a sound. When it was over, he looked up at his father with that same empty smile, that same knowing amusement, and spoke words that Esteban would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. "Is that all? I barely felt anything." "Is that the best you can do, old man?" After that night, the family slept in shifts. Someone always had to be awake, watching, making sure Rosendo did not finish what he had started, did not creep into his sister's room with that knife or some other weapon. They became prisoners in their own home, hostages to the monster they had created, living in a state of constant vigilance that wore them down day by day, that aged them years in a matter of months. School ended for Rosendo at 14, not because he was expelled, though God knows there were reasons enough for any school to wash its hands of him, but because no school would take him anymore. Teachers refused to enter classrooms where he sat, claimed illness rather than face those empty eyes. Parents threatened to pull their children out entirely, said they would rather have their sons and daughters grow up illiterate than risk them being in the same room as Rosendo Malverde. The principal, a man who had dedicated his life to education, who believed that every child deserved a chance, finally told Esteban that his son was no longer welcome. "He is not a student," the principal said, unable to meet Esteban's eyes, his voice heavy with a defeat that went beyond this single situation. "He is a predator, and I will not provide him any more prey." Esteban tried to put his son to work in the fields, hoping that hard labor might burn away some of the darkness, that exhaustion might leave no energy for cruelty. But Rosendo despised everything about farming, about the land, about the simple, honest life his family had lived for generations. He saw it as beneath him, as a waste of the potential he believed he possessed. "You want me to waste my life shoveling manure?" he spat during one of their many arguments, his voice dripping with contempt. "I was born for greater things. I'm going to leave a mark on this world that no one will ever forget. People will speak my name with fear for generations after I am gone." Eventually, Esteban found him work with a local contractor named Don Camillo, a man who built houses in the surrounding villages and was desperate enough for cheap labor to overlook the rumors that followed Rosendo like flies follow rotting meat. The labor was hard and the pay minimal, but at least it got Rosendo out of the house during the day, gave the family a few hours of peace. Don Camillo's crew learned quickly to avoid the new worker, to give him space, to never turn their backs on him. He was lazy, argumentative, prone to sudden rages that could be triggered by the smallest slight, the most innocent comment. He threatened men twice his size, described in vivid detail what he would do to them if they crossed him. He sabotaged equipment when he felt disrespected. He emanated a wrongness that made everyone uncomfortable, that made horses shy away, and dogs growl and birds fall silent when he passed. The incident with Julio Vega happened when Rosendo was 20 years old. Julio was a young man from a village to the south, recently married, recently become a father, desperate for work to support his growing family. He had a quick smile and an easy laugh, the kind of person who makes friends everywhere he goes, who lights up rooms just by walking into them. He told jokes to lighten the mood during long, hot days of physical labor, to make the work seem less grueling, to build camaraderie among the crew. His fatal mistake was making Rosendo the target of one of those jokes. It was nothing serious, a handful of dirt dropped into a water bottle. the kind of harmless prank that construction workers have played on each other since the pyramids were built, a small initiation ritual for the new members of a crew. Julio did not know the stories about Rosendo. He did not understand what he was dealing with. He saw only a sullen young man who kept to himself and thought some friendly teasing might help him open up, might help him become part of the team. When Rosendo discovered the dirt in his water, took a drink, and felt the grit on his tongue, he did not react with the expected anger, the shouting and cursing and threats that the other workers had learned to expect. He simply set the bottle down, looked around at the laughing workers with an expression of calm assessment, identified the culprit, and smiled. That smile should have been a warning, but Julio did not know how to read it. That night, when the rest of the crew had gone home to their families, Julio stayed behind to finish some work he had fallen behind on. He was a conscientious man, the kind of worker who took pride in doing things right. Rosendo stayed too, claiming he wanted to help, claiming he had no hard feelings about the joke. They found what was left of Julio 3 years later, buried under the foundation of a house he had helped to build. His skull had been shattered by repeated blows from a shovel, the bone fragments scattered through the surrounding soil. His limbs had been arranged in positions that suggested he had died slowly, that he had been made to understand exactly what was happening to him, that Rosendo had taken his time, had savored every moment. But the detail that haunted the investigators, the detail that would become local legend, was the skull itself. The jaw was locked open in what appeared to be a grin, as if Julio had died laughing at some cosmic joke only he could hear, or as if something else had been laughing through him, using his mouth and his voice in those final, terrible moments. The case was never solved. By the time the body was discovered, Rosendo was long gone, vanished into the chaos of Mexico City, swallowed by a metropolis of 20 million people, where one more predator could easily disappear. He announced his departure a few weeks after Julio's disappearance, before anyone started asking difficult questions, before the suspicion that hung in the air could crystallize into accusations. He said he was tired of small-town life, tired of small-minded people who could not appreciate his potential, tired of wasting his gifts on manual labor and petty conflicts. "I am going to make something of myself," he told his family, his bags already packed, his truck already loaded. "I am going to be someone important, someone feared, someone whose name will be remembered long after this pathetic village has crumbled to dust." No one tried to stop him. The rancho breathed a collective sigh of relief when his truck disappeared over the horizon, when the dust cloud marking his passage faded into the blue sky. Children started playing outside again, their laughter filling streets that had been silent with fear. Adults stopped jumping at shadows, stopped looking over their shoulders, stopped waking in the night with their hearts pounding, and the sense that something was standing at the foot of their bed. Even the animals seemed calmer, as if some predatory presence had finally left their territory. Esperanza lit candles to the Virgin that night, dozens of them filling the small church with flickering light. She lit them in thanksgiving, which was perhaps the most damning testimony to what her son had become. A mother grateful that her child was gone, a mother praying not for his safe journey, but for his permanent absence. Marisol, the sister he had terrorized that night with the knife, entered a convent in Oaxaca the following year. She took vows of silence and poverty and obedience, dedicated her life to prayer and contemplation, tried to find in God the peace that her brother had stolen from her. She has not spoken to anyone in our family since Rosendo's funeral. I have heard that she still wakes screaming sometimes, still sees her brother's face in her nightmares, still hears his voice promising to finish what he started, but I do not know if even convent walls can protect her from what follows the Malverde name. For 20 years, Mexico City swallowed Rosendo Malverde whole and made him into something even worse than he had been before. 20 million people spread across a valley ringed by mountains and choked with smog, living in everything from gleaming skyscrapers to cardboard shacks, speaking 100 languages and practicing 1,000 faiths and pursuing 10,000 different dreams. It was the perfect hunting ground for a predator learning to perfect his craft, a jungle where the strong devoured the weak, and no one asked too many questions about the screaming that sometimes echoed from abandoned buildings in the night. In a city that size, people disappear every single day. Most are never found. Most are never even looked for. The missing blend into the anonymous masses, their absence noted only by the families left behind to wonder and grieve and eventually inevitably give up hope. Rosendo started in construction, the only work he knew, the only skill he possessed that could be exchanged for legitimate money. But he quickly discovered that his true talents lay elsewhere, that the darkness inside him had commercial applications he had never imagined. There were people in the city who needed things done, ugly things. Necessary things, they called them, using the language of business to disguise the reality of what they were asking for. They needed problem-solved competitors, eliminated debts collected in ways that ensured future payments would never be late. They needed someone without conscience, without limits, without the hesitation that makes normal people pause before crossing certain lines. Rosendo had no such hesitation. He had no such lines. The darkness that had lived inside him since birth had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and it seized it with both hands. The criminal underworld of Mexico City embraced him like a prodigal son returning home. He rose quickly through ranks that most men spent lifetimes climbing, not through intelligence or political skill or personal loyalty, but through a simple willingness to do what others would not. He became known as someone who could solve any problem permanently, someone who never flinched, someone who actually seemed to enjoy the work in ways that disturbed even hardened killers who thought they had seen everything. News of his activities trickled back to our rancho, occasionally carried by travelers and traders and relatives who had moved to the city seeking better lives. The stories came in fragments, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when children entered the room, dark hints that painted a picture no one wanted to examine too closely. They said he had become a specialist in making people disappear, that he had developed techniques for disposing of bodies that left no evidence, no traces, nothing for grieving families to bury or forensic investigators to analyze. They said he signed his work with a letter carved into flesh, an M, directly over the heart, a signature that let anyone who found the bodies know exactly who was responsible. And through it all, through 20 years of violence and darkness and unspeakable acts, he maintained his obsession with the devil. In every cantina where he drank, in every dark room where he conducted his bloody business, Rosendo made the same declaration. He was the son of El Diablo. He was more evil than Satan himself. When they finally met, he would prove himself worthy of the bloodline he claimed. Then, at 40 years old, he came home. No one knows exactly why. Some said he had made enemies too powerful even for him. Others said the authorities were finally closing in. But I think something called him back. The same force that had whispered to him since childhood wanted him home for what was to come. He arrived in a black pickup truck that cost more than most houses in our rancho. He wore clothes that would have fed a family for a year. He had grown into a massive figure, thick with muscle, covered in scars that told stories no one wanted to hear. He bought the largest property in the area and hired local women to clean and cook, paying them enough to ensure their silence. And every night, without fail, he went to the cantinas. "I am Rosendo Malverde," he would shout. "Even El Diablo himself fears me. When I finally meet him, I will make him bow." 3 months after his return, on a night when storm clouds hid the stars, Rosendo committed his final murder. His name was Eduardo Reyes, a stranger from another town, who made the fatal mistake of calling Rosendo a liar in front of a crowded cantina. Rosendo followed him into the darkness outside of town. He took his time with Eduardo the way an artist takes time with a masterpiece. When it was finished, he dragged the body into the forest. Then he started walking home, whistling a cheerful tune. He never got the chance to tell anyone about this night. The figure appeared without warning, stepping out of shadows that should not have been deep enough to hide anything. He was tall, well-dressed, with eyes that seemed to shift and swirl like windows into an endless void. "Hello, Rosendo," the stranger said. "I have been listening to you for a very long time. I thought it was finally time we met." And in that moment, for the first time in 4 decades, Rosendo Malverde understood what fear truly meant. The stranger circled him slowly, and with each step the temperature dropped, the darkness deepened. "You know who I am," the stranger said. "You have been calling my name since before you could walk." Rosendo's hand dropped to his machete, but his fingers would not close around the handle. "You have called me El Diablo, El Chamuco, El Maligno." The stranger spread his arms wide. "But the name you use most often is my personal favorite, Father." "You are not real," Rosendo whispered. The stranger laughed a sound like graves opening. "I am more real than you have ever been. And you are nothing but a small, angry insect who has spent his entire life buzzing in my ear." The stranger leaned closer, and Rosendo could smell sulfur and smoke and something sweetly rotten. "You said you were my son." "That I should fear you, so prove it. Show me what you can do." Rosendo tried to speak, to fight, to do anything, but he could only stand there as 40 years of bravado crumbled into nothing. The stranger shook his head in disappointment. "Nothing. I expected more. But you are just another small man with a loud voice and an empty soul." He began to fade into the darkness. "I will return for you, Rosendo Malverde, very soon. And when I do, you will understand what true darkness really means." Then he was gone, and Rosendo ran. For the first time since childhood, he ran from something. He crashed through the scrubland branches, tearing at his face, and did not stop until he reached his house. He locked every door, barred every window, turned on every light, but he knew the stranger would return. The weeks that followed were a descent into hell. He stopped leaving his house. The nights brought dreams of doors opening into absolute darkness, of his victims standing in endless rows waiting. And behind them all the stranger with the burning eyes. He tried everything, crosses on every wall, salt across every threshold, prayers that felt like ash in his mouth. Nothing worked. Messages appeared in impossible places. "Soon. I am waiting. You belong to me." His dog vanished and was found dead at the bottom of a well, its fur turned completely white, frightened to death. The visits began in the 4th week. "Knock, knock, 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 knock. I know you are in there, Rosendo. I can smell your fear." "Go away," Rosendo whispered. The stranger laughed. "Go away, but you invited me. You've been inviting me for 40 years. The visits continued. Every few nights the stranger would come and describe what awaited Rosendo in exquisite detail. "You will not simply suffer. You will become suffering. And it will last forever." 6 weeks after the first encounter, Rosendo was a shell of what he had been. He had lost 30 pounds. His hair was falling out. He trembled constantly. Then Marcos came. Marcos Delgado had been Rosendo's closest associate during the Mexico City years. When he saw what his old friend had become, he barely recognized him. "You need to get out of this house," Marcos said. "Come out with me tonight. It will do you good." Rosendo refused, but Marcos insisted. And Rosendo was so tired, so desperate, that he finally agreed. They drove to a cantina in a neighboring pueblo. For a few hours, things almost felt normal. They drank, they talked. Rosendo even laughed. Maybe he had been imagining things. Maybe there was no devil coming for him. By the time they left, well past midnight, Rosendo had almost convinced himself everything would be fine. They drove back on a dark road through desert hills, and there in the headlights stood a figure. Marcos slammed on the brakes. The truck slowed with unnatural graduality. The headlights died. The engine fell silent. And in the darkness, Rosendo saw what was waiting. It was not the stranger in the suit. This was something else entirely. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall. Massive horns curved from a skull covered in skin the color of dried blood. Its eyes were pits of flame. A tail, thick and segmented, curled behind it. Its mouth revealed rows of teeth like broken glass. "Rosendo," it breathed. "I told you I would return." Marco screamed and ran into the darkness. Rosendo tried to follow, but his body would not obey. Something held him pinned to the seat. The creature approached each footfall, leaving a smoking print on the asphalt. It leaned through the window. "You wanted to meet me. You wanted to prove yourself worthy, so prove it, son. Show me what you can do." All that came out of Rosendo was a thin whine. The creature laughed. "That is what I thought." It reached through the window and placed one massive, clawed hand on Rosendo's chest, directly over his heart. The pain was beyond description. He saw everything, every person he had hurt, every life he had destroyed. He felt it all, simultaneously, eternally. "This is what you wanted," the creature whispered. "This is what it means to be the child of darkness." Rosendo's heart seized, once, twice, 3 times, and then it stopped. The creature stepped back. "Welcome home, Rosendo Malverde." Then it was gone, and there was nothing left but a corpse in a truck on a dark road, and the echo of laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They found him the next morning when the sun had barely crested the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose that seemed obscene, given what waited on that lonely road. A farmer named Guillermo Ochoa was driving his old pickup truck toward the fields when he spotted the black vehicle blocking the road ahead, its doors hanging open like the wings of a dead bird. There was no sign of movement from inside, no response when he called out a greeting. Guillermo approached cautiously, expecting a breakdown or perhaps a drunk driver sleeping off a long night of poor decisions. What he found sent him stumbling backward, crossing himself so frantically that his hand became a blur, his lips moving in prayers he had not spoken since childhood, since his grandmother had taught him the words to ward off evil. Rosendo Malverde sat in the driver's seat, rigid as a statue carved from stone, every muscle locked in the final spasm of death. His hands still gripped the steering wheel with such force that his knuckles had turned white, the tendons standing out beneath skin that had taken on a grayish-purple hue that no living flesh should ever display. His face was frozen in an expression of such absolute terror that Guillermo would see it in his nightmares for the rest of his days, would wake sweating and gasping and reaching for the rosary on his bedside table. The mouth stretched wide in a silent scream that would never end. The lips pulled back to expose teeth clenched so tightly that several had cracked from the pressure. But the eyes were the worst part. They were gone, not damaged, not closed, simply gone as if they had never existed, as if they had been erased from reality by something that did not obey the laws of physics or biology. 2 empty sockets stared out from that frozen face, black holes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, that seemed to pull at your gaze and hold it against your will. There was no blood around the wounds, no sign of trauma or violence, no indication of how such a thing could have happened. The eyes had simply ceased to exist, as if whatever Rosendo had seen in his final moments had been so horrific that his eyes had chosen oblivion rather than continue seeing it. The police arrived within the hour, followed by investigators from the regional capital, who had heard rumors about the infamous Rosendo Malverde and wanted to see for themselves how such a man had met his end. They documented everything with cameras that kept malfunctioning, with notebooks that kept getting lost, with recording devices that captured nothing but static and whispers that might have been voices or might have been the wind. The coroner estimated that Rosendo had been dead for approximately 6 hours, placing his death somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. But the state of the body contradicted this assessment in ways that defied explanation. The decomposition was too advanced, the discoloration too pronounced, the smell too overwhelming. The corpse looked and smelled like it had been rotting for weeks, as if death had been eager to claim it. as if decay had begun even before the heart stopped beating, as if something had accelerated the natural process of dissolution. Then they moved the body and found what was on his back. 3 numbers carved into the flesh with surgical precision that no human hand could have achieved, each digit nearly 10 centimeters tall, cut deep enough to expose the muscle beneath the edges of the wounds, cauterized as if by intense heat. The wounds were still fresh, still weeping a thin fluid that was not quite blood, that was darker and thicker and smelled of something sulphurous. And they were still smoking thin wisps of vapor rising from the carved flesh, as if the numbers had been branded rather than cut, as if they had been seared into his soul as much as his skin. The mark of the beast, the signature of the devil, the receipt for a soul that had finally been collected. One young officer, barely 22 years old, with a wife and newborn son waiting at home, took one look at those numbers and walked away from the scene without a word. He drove straight to the nearest church and spent the next 3 days in confession, telling the priest everything he had seen, begging for assurance that he would not share Rosendo's fate. He resigned from the force the following week and became a farmer, working the land his grandfather had left him. He never spoke of what he had witnessed, but his wife told neighbors that he never slept through the night again, that he woke screaming at least once a week, that he kept every light in their house burning from sunset to sunrise, because he could no longer bear the darkness. They tried to bury Rosendo in consecrated ground. Esperanza insisted on it, despite everything, despite the decades of estrangement, despite knowing exactly what her son had become and what he had done. She was still his mother. She had carried him in her womb, had nursed him at her breast, had loved him even when loving him felt like embracing a fire that wanted nothing more than to consume her. She wanted to believe that even now, even after everything, there might be some chance for his soul, some possibility of redemption that only God could grant. The church disagreed. Father Miguel, the young priest who had replaced Father Fernando years earlier, was a modern man, educated in theology and psychology, skeptical of the old superstitions that still lingered in rural communities. He agreed to perform the funeral mass because he believed that even the worst sinners deserved the rituals of the faith, the chance for whatever redemption might still be possible. He changed his mind the moment the coffin crossed the threshold of the sanctuary. Every candle in the church died simultaneously, dozens of flames snuffed out by an invisible breath that moved faster than sight could follow. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the mourners could see their breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The flowers arranged around the altar wilted before their eyes, petals falling like tears of blood leaves, curling and blackening as if touched by an invisible frost. Father Miguel tried to continue. His voice shook as he read from his prayer book the familiar words, feeling strange and hollow in his mouth. He reached for the holy water, intending to bless the coffin as tradition required. The water was boiling. Steam rose from the font, and when Father Miguel jerked his burned hand back with a cry of pain, everyone present heard what came next, from inside the sealed coffin, scratching. Rhythmic, deliberate, patient, like fingernails dragging across wood in a pattern that might have been random or might have been a message. Knocking. The same pattern that had haunted Rosendo in his final weeks. Knock, 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 knock. And then laughter, low and mocking and utterly inhuman, muffled by the wood, but unmistakable, the sound of something that found the entire situation enormously amusing. "Get it out!" Father Miguel shouted, stumbling backward from the altar, knocking over candles and scattering sacred objects in his haste to put distance between himself and that coffin. "Get it out of God's house, now, now!" The pallbearers grabbed the coffin and rushed for the door, nearly dropping it in their haste. The moment it crossed the threshold, leaving the sanctuary, the candles flickered back to life. The temperature returned to normal, and the remaining flowers stopped their accelerated decay. Father Miguel stood in the doorway, making the sign of the cross over and over, his lips moving in prayers that brought him no comfort. As I passed him on my way out, following the chaos of the aborted funeral, I heard him whisper something that has stayed with me ever since. That thing was never human. Whatever wore that body, whatever looked out through those eyes, it was never one of God's children. It was something else entirely, something that should never have been born into this world. They buried Rosendo in the civil cemetery in an unmarked grave at the far corner where the ground was rocky and weeds grew thick and no one ever visited. No prayers were said, no blessings were given. The grave diggers worked as fast as physically possible and refused to return after dark even when offered triple their normal wages. Strange things began happening around that grave almost immediately. The earth above the burial site stayed warm regardless of weather or season. Grass refused to grow there. Flowers withered within hours. People who walked past at night reported hearing sounds from below. Moaning, weeping, and sometimes on the darkest nights screaming, the sounds of a soul learning what forever truly meant. Marcos Delgado, the friend who fled that night on the road, spent his remaining years in a psychiatric facility in Monterey. He never recovered from what he had witnessed, never formed a complete sentence again, never stopped screaming at exactly 3:33 every morning. He died 6 years after Rosendo choking on his own tongue during a seizure. The orderly who found him said that in his final moments, Marcos had been smiling. Not a peaceful smile. The smile of someone who was finally mercifully being released from a prison worse than death. 25 years have passed since that night on the dark road. I am 73 years old now. Most of the people who knew Rosendo are gone. A new generation has grown up, young people who know the story only as legend, a cautionary tale whispered around fires. But I remember. 2 nights ago, something happened that made me finally decide to tell this story. I was sitting in my living room reading by lamplight when I heard a knock at my door. Knock, 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 knock. The same pattern, the same rhythm, the sound that Rosendo described hearing in the weeks before his death. I did not answer. I sat perfectly still until dawn. In the morning, I found a message traced on my window written in condensation that should not have been there. Thank you for telling my story. Now they will know my name, and when they speak it, I will hear. I do not know what this means. I do not know if sharing Rosendo's story will save anyone or damn them. But the story demanded to be told. So now you know. About Rosendo Malverde. About the devil who answered his call. About the price of challenging forces beyond human comprehension. And now you carry this story too. If you hear a knock tonight in that rhythm, do not answer. If you see a message on your window, do not read it aloud. If you feel the urge to speak the name of darkness, to challenge forces you do not understand, swallow those words. Let them die in your throat. Because fear is not weakness, fear is wisdom, fear is survival. Rosendo Malverde spent his entire life proving he was not afraid of anything. Look what happened to him. And may God have mercy on anyone foolish enough to follow his path, because nothing else will.